had a claim to the English throne through her bloodline.
Although it's commonly thought that Henry was born in a tower in this castle, he was actually born in its courtyard in a little house.
So due to his claim to the throne and the Yorkist and Lancastrian conflict at the time, Henry was exiled to France at the age of 14.
14 years later, Henry Tudor sails back to Wales, where he begins his campaign to challenge King Richard III.
Henry VII came to England in what was his second invasion. The first had failed as the rebellion had been put down before he had even arrived in England. He had the support of the French king, who had joined his cause after rumours of Richard III's planned invasion of France spread.
Richard had prepared a battle of 10,000 to 12,000 men, while Henry had only 5,000 to 6,000. The battle took place on the 22nd of August 1485, and Henry marched in while Richard stood upon a hill waiting to attack his enemy.
There was actually a third force present at the battle. This was led by Henry's father-in-law, who was sort of renowned for not joining in a battle until it was clear who the victor would be. The third force joined in the battle after Richard charged towards Henry in a final stand. They surrounded Richard's army, and when Richard was cut down, Henry was found by his father-in-law on the battlefield.
There is a real risk, however, of the country being split into two factions. So Margaret Beaufort encourages her son, Henry VII, to marry Elizabeth of York, a member of the rival faction. As a result, she effectively helps unite the country and lays the foundation for the Tudor dynasty. Her role sets the tone for many strong women who, as we will see, will shape the course of English history. In the meantime, Henry has other pressing problems.
Henry VII needed a son and heir to secure the succession and the Tudor dynasty.
Elizabeth gave birth to a son named Arthur on the 19th of September 1486.
He was followed by a daughter named Margaret
and a son named Henry
in 1491. So Henry was followed by a daughter named Elizabeth,
though she died at the age of 3, and was followed by a son named Edmund,
who died at the age of 1.
Arthur was given a king's education at Ludlow Castle, specialising in subjects such as history, geography and politics.
Here he was given the responsibilities of the Prince of Wales, and he was married to Catherine of Aragon to strengthen the Anglo-Spanish alliance. However, Arthur died within months of the nuptials of the sweating sickness, leaving the future Henry VIII as heir. Henry VIII acceded the throne after the death of Henry VII. The Tudor dynasty is often reduced to Henry VIII's marital affairs, and usually reduced to divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. This misses the point. Tudor history is, more than anything, a history of strong women playing significant roles in shaping the course of history. The choices of Henry's wives, the timing of their marriages, and the specific circumstances surrounding each marriage contributed to the events and decisions that shaped the Tudor era and English history.
Catherine was concerned, along with Henry, with giving them both an heir to succeed them. Finally, Catherine delivered a healthy baby daughter who they christened Mary. Mary received a fine education and began an era for well-educated, aristocratic girls. So, with Catherine of Aragon ageing, it was very unlikely that she would ever be able to conceive and deliver a son.
Henry began to ask his advisors to search for possible ways to gain an annulment.
In 1522, Anne Boleyn arrived in England from France and soon caught the eye of Henry VIII. He now had a second option, Anne Boleyn, who was younger and more likely to be able to conceive and deliver a healthy child. So, Henry's wife had been, as we know, formally married to Arthur, Henry's brother, and when she'd married Henry, she used the excuse that she had never consummated the marriage with him. Henry claimed that she had, meaning that they were brother and sister and illegal in marriage. He was desperate to marry Anne. Protestantism was already growing in England. It was strange that Henry was moving towards this.
He had written a whole book in defence of the Catholic Church, following the attack on it by Martin Luther. As well as that, he was on quite good terms with the papacy before then. He had been offered the title of Most Christian King instead of the King of France.
Thus, the Reformation began. A lot of people blame Anne Boleyn for what happened next. It is true that she came to England with a Protestant Bible. It was always going to come.
In a sense, it already had, with all of the Protestant scholars and authors writing books in favour of Protestantism and showing the idea of the king being the head of the church of that country rather than the Pope.
So Henry had Catherine of Aragon banished to Kimbolton House. Between the years of 1532 and 1534, he finalised the break from Rome. Now this was a drastic mistake. France and Spain were pious Catholic countries and extremely wealthy and powerful. By breaking from the Catholic Church, he was severing any bonds. Also, Catherine had led England to great success, and Mary was seen as the rightful heir. She was admired among the people, and they thought that she would be queen, and seeing her claimed illegitimate was a scandal. It was an outrage.
Henry and Anne were officially wed, and a few days later, actually, was only when Henry's first marriage was declared invalid and annulled.
So Anne was already pregnant, which was a good sign because Henry had moved heaven and earth to get an heir. He was desperate for a son. On the 7th of September, Anne delivered a healthy baby girl, and they christened her Elizabeth after both of her grandmothers. Now, of course, she wasn't the son Henry had been desperate for, but as he coldly reminded his wife, sons would surely follow.
So, essentially, his having a daughter and a healthy child already, he was immediately getting the rewards of this split from Rome, of this annulment of his first marriage to Catherine, and he was pleased with himself for it.
So Anne had 2 more pregnancies that did end negatively, and this left her shaken, and she was very upset. There's a myth that Anne was a neglectful mother, but really this isn't true. She adored Elizabeth, she cared for her, she visited her Hatfield house where Elizabeth had been moved to as much as she could. Now, the relationship between Mary and Anne is remarkable.
It was strained, to say the least. Anne was frequently called by Mary the concubine, so Mary made it clear that she did not accept Anne as the queen and wife to her father.
Anne had asked Mary to accept her and said that she would be welcome back to court. But Mary had been treated awfully, and she was not ready to accept the woman who had caused her and her mother so much difficulty.
She had been sent to quite literally serve her half-sister, who they had made it clear was her replacement.
Here's where things sort of start to go downhill a bit, when Henry and Anne go on summer progress. So summer progress was when the house would be cleaned, and the king and queen would venture across England. Anne Boleyn had a lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, and one of the destinations that Henry and Anne landed at was her family's home, Wolf Hall. This is where Henry noticed Jane for the first time, not as a potential wife, but merely as a mistress while Anne would be pregnant. After this trip, Anne declared that she was pregnant, which was excellent news, but Henry began to openly court Jane Seymour, which distressed Anne. Henry was very fond of jousting, so he held a tournament.
There was an issue with his jousting armour, so he was struck down from his horse, and it caused injuries to him, which many say caused the huge shift in his behaviour.
Anne Boleyn was understandably distraught. She knew that if Henry died, she and Elizabeth would be in so much danger. Anne Boleyn was in trouble now. Henry had begun to seriously court Jane Seymour. Anne asked one of her chaplains to ensure that should anything happen to her, Elizabeth would be safe, which tells us that she was certain that misfortune lay ahead. They had her arrested. At her trial, she was found guilty of crimes, none of which she had committed.
In the final show of what was claimed to be mercy, Henry sent for a French swordsman to sort of speed up the death.
Jane went into labour on the 9th of October 1537. She delivered a healthy son. October the 13th is St Edward's Day, so he was naturally named after this saint. Around a week later, Jane began showing signs of being unwell.
And at the start, around the time of the christening, it did seem like it was going to be fine.
But it began to go downhill, and the people court realised that the Queen was severely unwell. She died on the 24th of October 1537 of childbed fever or
Food poisoning, which could have contributed to her demise.
A common misconception is that Henry's favourite wife was Jane.
He actually warned her of the fate that Anne Boleyn had met, saying, if you continue to meddle in these matters of the kingdom, you will die.
He told her that she would do well to focus on their children rather than the ones that his previous wives had had, which was kind of almost like a little threat, because Anne hadn't had a son, and neither had Catherine, and they had met quite awful fates. But Henry knew the need for a spare, seeing as he had been one after his brother Arthur had died. He was reluctant to remarry, but the need to have a second son drove him to search for another wife.
Especially since in Europe, the importance of having an alliance would be incredibly important.
Henry also couldn't make any alliances with the Catholic countries. That in itself was a threat towards him as a reformist country. So he began looking at Protestant alliances, and he landed on the obvious one, which was Germany. John of Cleves had 2 daughters, and Henry had Hans Holbein sent to Germany to paint portraits for Amalia and Anne of Cleves. Henry developed an obsession with the elder of the two, Anne. Henry had Anne brought to England.
England was incredibly different. That in itself was a shock. But it wasn't the only shock.
So Henry liked to dress himself as a peasant, and she'd never seen a portrait of him, and he was this old man who was severely overweight with an ulcerated leg. Anne had no idea it was the King of England, and she was obviously revolted and shocked. Henry's pride was severely hurt. He decided straight away he didn't like Anne.
So the wedding did go ahead, as the alliance with Cleves was of immense importance to England. But even from the start, Henry was looking at ways of sort of having a diplomatic annulment in which both Cleves and Anne herself wouldn't put up much of a fight.
They did not consummate the marriage because Henry claimed that she failed to inspire him to do so. He asked almost straight away if Thomas Cromwell could look at ways to annul the marriage.
And Henry was already quite infamous. If this annulment did go ahead with Anne, there weren't many wives whose families would accept a match with the King of England, as he had found ways to get rid of all of his wives so far.
Anne quickly formed a friendship with Mary.
It's quite doubtful that she was really so awful, and as Henry reported, seeing as Hans Holbein, who had been sent to paint her, suffered no repercussions from this supposed misrepresentation of her.
So Henry quickly developed a relationship with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. So Henry was looking at ways to annul the marriage to Anne, and he did eventually ask her if she would consent to the annulment.
Now, of course, this had sort of happened before with Catherine of Aragon, and of course she had not consented. So Anne learnt from that.
So, yeah, she'd seen the horror that Catherine of Aragon's life had become. She was not keen to ruin her own life over this. She consented to this. Thomas Cromwell was severely punished for this. Thomas Cromwell was executed, and Anne was richly rewarded for her consent. She allowed the annulment to go ahead, and she was gifted Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, which had been the residence of Anne Boleyn.
She and Henry remained on quite good terms after. In fact, they became incredibly good friends, and Anne lived out her life under Henry's reign as a rich woman. So she remained unmarried for the rest of her life.
So during Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, he took an interest in the young Catherine Howard. So she had been raised by Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Howard family was very influential, but her father had been one of many children and hadn't inherited much, so it wasn't unheard of to send the children of poorer family members to wealthier ones. So the problem was that Agnes Howard often, neglected many of the girls in her care, and they would have older men come into their bedroom late at night. So Catherine had a relationship with the 23-year-old Henry Mannix when she was 13, which is obviously massively inappropriate. And later, she had a relationship with Frances Derham, who was the Dowager's secretary.
So Catherine married Henry after the annulment with Anne, and she was quite close to Elizabeth, as Anne Boleyn had actually been Catherine Howard's cousin.
So Catherine used to parade around the young lady Elizabeth, and not in a very motherly way. So Elizabeth was really not used to this level of attention and care. Catherine would often play with her little cousin, and she would take her around court with her.
Now, the new queen didn't pay so much attention to her eldest stepdaughter, and though they did admittedly have a few sort of quite cold conversations, and the issue was partly the age, as they were quite close in age, and in fact Catherine's stepdaughter Mary was older than her, so that didn't really set them off to a good start.
So Catherine complained that Mary didn't give her enough respect in comparison to some of her other stepmothers. It probably was true, but from looking at it from Mary's perspective, Catherine was, a considerable many years younger than her, and she was Protestant, which was, not Mary's preferred religion, and, she did take Mary's disrespect a little too far by dismissing one of her ladies-in-waiting.
So the two ladies-in-waiting, which were dismissed, were actually said to have died of grief. So of course this made it even worse. This whole, of course they disliked each other even more now, although it is thought that they did make up to a certain extent, as they did exchange New Year's gifts, which Henry was incredibly pleased about.
So Catherine and Henry's relationship was quite, at the beginning it was good. Catherine made him feel young, and so there were several hints that Catherine actually may have been pregnant.
So these sort of reports and the evidence that we have for this came from the ambassadors. So the French ambassador used a word that was then described often to show that a woman was pregnant in an account of his visit to the English court. However, the fact that we don't have a great many records of this suggests that it didn't last long.
Catherine Howard is infamous with her so-called relationship with Thomas Culpeper. In the musical Six, they paint her as kind of a keen adulterer. Historians fear that she could have been as young as 15 when she married the steadily aging king. And he was, he was old. His ulcerated leg didn't make him any more attractive. And he was very tyrannical. So being his wife is a stressful position, and it comes with many dangers.
And of course, she'd been taken advantage of with her youth, and it had happened again by the king.
So Thomas Culpeper had a very bloody and dark past, sexual assault and murder, and he'd only really been excused because of his favour with the king, and he was one of the revered friends of Henry. So in 1541, he and Catherine spent time together, and well, they would communicate through letters, and later one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, who was the former wife of George Boleyn, reported that a sort of relationship was forming between them.
And we do have evidence of this with surviving letters. Of course, these don't fully show quite what was happening.
So things sort of began to go downhill for Catherine quite quickly. She was not greatly popular among the people, and nor was she at court. So Francis Derham returned to court, and so he had been sent away by the Dowager Duchess, and he'd said to her that he would marry Catherine upon his return. So finding that she was married to the king was quite a shock for the secretary. So Catherine gave him a position in return for his silence. She knew that this wasn't the best thing to be paraded around court.
If it were revealed, the fault would automatically be put on her rather than Derham himself.
Yeah.
So it coming to light would be immensely dangerous, especially considering position at court was already quite a troublesome and unpopular one.
So Thomas Cranmer did find out about her former engagements with Derham and Manox, and he actually had them both interrogated. Now, Catherine wasn't completely sure of what was going on, and we don't know really what went on between her and Thomas Culpeper. We're not sure how far it got, but he did reveal her intentions towards her, which actually makes us think that they never did actually sleep together. He was in love with his young wife, and he just refused to believe all of these allegations and crimes that they charged her with. However, after Lady Rochford's admitting to the relationship, and Derham actually admitted to it under duress, Henry faced the truth that Catherine had been unfaithful to him. Derham and Culpeper were all sentenced to death. Catherine was, very frightened. She was a teenager, and she was, being executed. When she entered Tower Greens, she was shaking. We can't really blame Catherine for a lot of this. She had been taken advantage of throughout her life. She had been treated terribly. She was a teenager. She was still basically a child. Being executed that young was tragic.
And you mentioned that this fate that she met affected Henry quite a lot more than it did when Anne Boleyn was executed.
He was sort of shocked.
And I feel this is partly due to the fact that with Anne Boleyn, these claims were fabricated. There wasn't this with Catherine Howard. It was accepted by him eventually that she was guilty.
We mentioned Lady Elizabeth. By this point, she'd had both of her maternal figures executed by her father, which was a horrible thing to have on the mind of any child. And people say that this is one of the key reasons that she never married in her later life. So in 1542, Catherine Howard lost her head. Henry he was never the same again.
Henry had to look again for another wife. He looked for a wife who there would be no doubt of the history of, and he came across Catherine Parr. Now, she had already been married twice beforehand, and she was of an age that would be unusual for a wife of the king. She was much older than a person would expect for the queen.
So this suggests that Henry ended his hunt for a spare and was now wanting a companion. Catherine Parr was described as tall with long red hair and generally very attractive. So she was intelligent, she was diplomatic, she was a Protestant reformist. Her previous marriage had ended in her being held hostage with her husband's children by Catholics. She was definitely leaning heavily towards the Protestant faith.
The wedding took place. She took great interest in both Edward and Elizabeth's educations.
Her namesake had been Catherine of Aragon, who was Lady Mary's mother. Now, automatically, Mary would have liked Catherine. She was an admirer of her mother. They were two also very intelligent, strong-minded women, and they bounced off each other. It was reported that they were almost always together. They were very good friends.
And the fact that they could put their quite large differences in faith beside them and become incredibly close to each other, it goes to show how genuinely sympathetic and how relatable they each were to each other.
And it also sort of proves wrong everything people have said about Mary, that she was, this Catholic who wouldn't listen to anything. She thought Protestantism was disgusting. She wasn't going to put off a good friendship by religion.
And Mary and Elizabeth as well both did a few translations for them.
So it really goes to show that Mary was clearly not the woman that history has painted her to be, and that she was not narrow-minded. She actually had a very open mind, and she was ready to accept different beliefs, different ideas on everything.
Now, unfortunately for Catherine, her husband was not quite so open-minded. Henry sort of took them as his wife being argumentative.
Catherine didn't view them this way. She thought herself and her husband as equals. She saw them as friendly debates. They would debate about religion, and she saw this as a kind of opportunity to put her ideas out there. And as friends and marriages go, you share your different beliefs, and you're obviously going to have differences. But Catherine didn't view this as her actively opposing what her husband said, more as just her expressing her belief system. Now, Henry was very opposed to her speaking out. He filed to have her killed.
He organised and signed a warrant for her arrest. Catherine was fairly popular, so she was warned of this by some members of the court. She said that she was ill, and then assured him that no, she hadn't meant to challenge him or argue with him at all. All the things she had said would just take his mind off his ulcerated leg. And the king believed this. He was quite happy with this answer. So when the men did come to arrest her, he got incredibly angry with them and he turned them away.
Catherine was active and she built proper relationships with all of Henry's children. And Edward, he would write to her instead of writing to Henry.
He would address her as dearest mother. He really accepted her as this maternal figure, and she played a huge part in the development of the personalities and people that her stepchildren grew to be. So she was extremely instrumental in this period, even as just one of the many wives of one of the kings. She really did make an incredibly large difference.
We think of Elizabeth I as this incredible ruler, but a lot of that is down to her, very influential and strong-minded stepmother who taught Elizabeth that women could do just as much, if not more, than men at the time, because Henry was not fit to rule at this point. He was very ill, he was tyrannical, and Elizabeth should have learnt from Catherine that women could achieve things, which is something she hadn't been taught throughout her life. Now, Henry's health steadily began to decline, and, he did take trips to France in which Catherine would act as regent.
It was a position which Henry's first wife had held while he was at war with France, and while Catherine of Aragon had held that position, she had actually been instrumental in the defeat of the Scottish at the Battle of Flodden. It wasn't unheard of for a woman to rule as regent.
Yeah, so Catherine of Aragon killed James IV of Scotland and, led him to victory, and he hadn't trusted any of his wives since then to hold this post. But it really showed how much he trusted and valued Catherine's abilities. And she's not really remembered for that, is she? She's sort of thought of as the matron wife who nursed her dying husband.
She did nurse him, she did guide him through his final years, but she did a lot more than that.
She really helped
keep England up while the king was not in the best state. So Henry's health really began to decline, and in 1548, after he returned both of his daughters to the line of succession, he died. Now, Catherine had played a large role in returning his daughters to the line of succession, which now this meant that if Edward died childless, they would inherit the throne.
Edward VI ascended the throne upon the death of his father. The 9-year-old king enforced strict Protestant laws, causing unrest and turmoil among the Catholic people. His temper echoed that of his father, and he was left enraged on many occasions when his capability was questioned. Due to frequent arguments with his sister Mary over religion, Edward altered the line of succession to favour the Protestant faith. So, upon his death at 15, Lady Jane Grey was declared Queen of England.
Mary was now queen. The question as who Mary would marry arose. She just did not want Elizabeth to succeed her because she was sure that Catholicism would die forever. When she was younger, she was sent to Ludlow, and she was even given the duties of an heir. And although she wasn't the male heir Henry had wanted to, he adored Mary. She was really given an excellent education, and she and Elizabeth, they were never going to be very close. The religion just barred the way from them having a very close sisterly relationship. Mary really adopted Elizabeth. We would assume that she would hate Elizabeth because her mother had, in her eyes, replaced her own mother, Catherine of Aragon. She was just able to put all of that aside. She was sort of the mother that Elizabeth had been denied.
So the quest sort of began to find a suitable husband. And also, the Italian wars were, of course, still ongoing. She needed an alliance. Of course, she had the freedom of allying with a Catholic country. It was suggested that she would wed Philip II of Spain.
Lady Jane Grey sort of fits into this now. There was a rebellion that sparked again to put Jane back on the throne. It frightened Philip from coming to England. Mary realised that as long as Jane lived, she would never be able to rule peacefully.
So not only was Jane this big sort of threat to the stability of the realm, so was her sister Elizabeth. And Mary was, honestly, she was so focused on trying to get them to convert. When neither of them converted, she was sort of forced to take action.
Jane couldn't do it. Mary had her executed.
The plans for Mary to be wed to Philip, these were still going ahead. This was incredibly unpopular. Philip was Catholic, and also he was Spanish. And the English, they didn't like this idea of a foreigner effectively ruling their country. So this decision to have Mary marry Philip II, this sparked rebellion. This was led by Thomas Wyatt the Younger. The aim of the rebellion was to put Elizabeth as queen.
Now, Mary, there was no way that she was going to kill Elizabeth. Her advisors told her, like, if you don't kill Elizabeth, you'll never have this peaceful rule that you killed Jane for. She decided that the only option was to lock her up. Elizabeth was taken to the bell tower. Mary's decision to lock her up was in favour of Elizabeth.
So to deal with this rebellion, she gave quite a motivating speech to the people of London, and tens of thousands of Londoners offered to defend London against these rebels. And Mary said, if possible, I want this to be solved peacefully. And she actually said that ultimately her only spouse was the kingdom, and Elizabeth is famous for that, but her sister also said that.
History has painted Mary as this, this crazy Catholic, burner of Protestants. She never wanted to impose religion.
After this rebellion was quashed, after peace sort of took over, she and Philip were wed shortly after. The wedding went ahead in 1554, after months of negotiations and delays with safety concerns for Philip.
So
Philip was said to be disappointed at his wife's age, which, you know, he could have found out that she was in her late 30s from, you know, he could have found out before this happened. So it was quite a bad choice to marry Philip. He was not faithful to her, and he was very unpopular among people of England.
So, to start with, the sort of unpopular nature of him, it came directly from him being not from England. The English were quite against this sort of foreign king. They wanted the king to be English, and they wanted Mary to have the power.
So Mary was also wanted to have the power, and she did not want a man to control her.
There was a specific decree passed directly surrounding the wedding and everything, stating that Philip did not have the whole power. New legislations would have to have both of their signatures.
And, you know, we always think of Elizabeth as the one who put down these boundaries and said, like, I won't marry, but she didn't want him to be running the kingdom.
So it's safe to say that while Philip did not love his new wife, she loved him. He wasn't faithful, but Mary sort of tried to look past that, just as her mother had done with Henry. So the first year that she was queen, she passed legislation undoing all of the reforms under Edward.
So any child that Mary would have would be raised as Catholic and would inherit the throne. This meant that Elizabeth would never be queen, and it would be a Catholic country.
So it was only shortly after the wedding, in September 1554, that the queen was believed to be with child. All of the physicians supported this. Every single person in the realm believed this.
However, as, you know, the 9th and 10th months ticked by, there was no sign of her going into labour.
She had many symptoms, which would suggest that she was going to have a child. She was even put in confinement, led to a false rumour that she had given birth to a healthy son. She came out of confinement months after, completely silent, impossibly thin, and it was never spoken of again at court.
Although she had passed acts meaning that he couldn't do things without her consent, he passed a lot of religious laws.
Philip, he sort of was a driving force to steer the country firmly Catholic. And the key law that's quite infamous is the heresy law. Any heathens would be executed by being burnt at the stake. There were accounts of it taking up to many hours for the person to die.
Mary's reputation and the epithet bloody does derive a lot from the laws that Philip passed. So Mary is given one of the worst reputations. A lot of it is down to misogyny, but it is a lot to do with her Catholic husband.
Around 286 people were burnt at the stake. Around 800 Protestants fled the country, the wealthy ones, places like Germany and modern-day Switzerland, where they would be safe from all these reforms.
So, although she is remembered as bloody, her father, Henry VIII, is estimated to have killed around 2% of the population in England, which is massive.
Philip left for the first time while Mary was believed to be pregnant with her first child. So he left shortly before she entered confinement to visit his father and discuss some legislations with him. He sort of kept up that pattern with leaving when she really did need him.
He would leave her for periods of time, and when he would leave her, it would break her heart. He asked her for army and money to help fund his war in France, and of course she said yes.
Now, money was quite tricky in that time. Economy had been debased by both Edward and Henry. Mary actually came up with possible laws which could be enacted and ways to add value to the economy. But those actually only passed in her sister Elizabeth's reign, so she is credited with those, while it was actually Mary who came up with which was against the French forces, but this was overshadowed by the successful siege of Calais by the French. So Calais was the last piece of land that the English held in mainland Europe, so this was quite a significant loss.
Mary's health did decline. So Elizabeth was moved from the Tower of London to a separate house, and Philip, he obviously wasn't that interested in Mary, and he was in Elizabeth, who was younger. It was quite clear now that Mary would never be able to conceive and deliver a healthy child. Philip persuaded Mary to name Elizabeth as her heir. Mary was reluctant to do this, and
she had tried time and time again to have Elizabeth to convert.
So Philip was massively in Elizabeth's favour. Elizabeth was actually eventually moved back to her childhood home of Hatfield House.
So Mary did die, and this was during her second phantom pregnancy. This time, though, no one believed it but her. And this was in the 17th of November, 1558.
When Elizabeth heard of Elizabeth's death, and she was queen now, she said, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes."
So Elizabeth was now queen.
As she grew, it was recognised by tutors that she was like something of a genius. She took great interest in all of her studies. She learnt many languages, and actually as a gift to Henry, she gave him this book of perfect translations. Elizabeth sort of saw that women seemed to be better off alone. She'd seen Catherine Howard and Jane Seymour as capable women who had met their fate in marriage. The Elizabethan religious settlement was passed, and she sort of did this to try and seal the divide between Protestants and Catholics, which had proved very troublesome during both Edward and Mary's reign. So Elizabeth had always been very focused on her image, and when she came to the throne, she was sort of this young beauty, and the age of chivalry was at its best. But she was quite self-conscious and trying desperately to maintain this youthful image that the public had of her. Yeah, so her rival in looks and in power, really, was Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne. So she fled to England. A lot of the Catholics in England and in Scotland did not like Elizabeth being her Protestant self on the throne. So they sought to replace her using forceful means with Mary. Elizabeth sort of realised that for as long as Mary lived, she would always be this Catholic figurehead. So she signed the death warrant, but I think many believe she never intended to use it.
This did not go down well at all in Europe, and monarchs of Catholic countries were shocked by it.
Philip II of Spain signed the Treaty of Joinville with France in 1584, and this was to abolish Protestantism in Europe.
So Elizabeth would also lead uprisings and rebellions against the Spanish Empire. She would supply resources and weapons, which was a huge act against Spain and did not go down at all well. Another thing was the targeting of Spanish ships by the English force. So of course in this time there was a large sort of rush with the aim of establishing colonies and trading systems with the New World, which was the continents of North and South America. So England had sort of been pushing to gain their chances, establishing colonies and gaining riches from there. They saw that as a huge opportunity to establish themselves as power. Spain, of course, was already largely involved over there, so the English took to targeting some of their ships and taking this stuff on board and delivering it back to England.
Elizabeth began Protestant reformations in the country, and Philip, to stop any more from going through, proposed to Elizabeth I. Elizabeth refused Philip II's proposal and instead continued with her reformations. In 1570, Pope Pius V decided to excommunicate Elizabeth I for charges of heresy. Philip II was originally against the idea, deciding that there should be better alternatives to deal with the problem. However, emissaries from Rome advised him against refusing. Elizabeth I then began to send Drake and Hawkins, two of her best privateers, to raid ports in the Caribbean that was greatly owned by the Spanish at the time. Drake then succeeded in attacking Cádiz, a port in the south of Spain, and destroying many shipments of wood for barrels, which caused many sailors to die on future ventures to America. Soon, Philip II of Spain had his plan formulated. His legendary commander, Álvaro de Bazán, would lead an invasion fleet to Ireland. There, they would rally the Catholics in the country and force the English to split their troops into two, whilst they captured a port in the south of England to receive more troops and supplies from Spain. However, this could not go through, as Álvaro de Bazán died shortly after the plan had been made. Instead, they hired another military general, Alejandro Farnesio. As he specialised in troops on land, he decided that he'd pick up the legendary Los Tercios and ship them to England. They decided to disembark 17,000 men and march to England to replace Elizabeth I. On the 30th of May, the Spanish fleet departed from Lisbon and went to La Coruña. However, they did not depart until the 22nd of June due to a large storm. They then sailed north and encountered English troops at Plymouth, where they had a small skirmish. And when they tried to go to Dunkirk to pick up their troops, they discovered that their ships were too large for the port. This being a failure, they returned to Spain. However, the English decided to send flaming ships around the 8th of August. These caused almost no effect, and the Spanish only lost 4 ships in this battle. The English were then forced to return to England as they had a lack of supplies and ammunition. The Spanish, deciding to return home themselves, decided to go north and sail along the coast of the British Isles. Many of their ships were wrecked across Ireland, and 72% of the ships returned home.
So Elizabeth was a big fan of William Shakespeare, and she would have him perform for her because, remember, he was an actor as well, and she valued him very highly. In the winter of 1602, she caught a cold, and this took a massive toll on her health, and the doctors told her that she could recover, but she was alone in the world now. Everyone she loved was gone, and being highly religious, she believed that she would meet them again. She died in 1603. So Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James, he succeeded Elizabeth. It was an amazing idea to do the documentary, and we're so lucky to have this chance.
My job is to keep everybody happy, and then if people are too fast, I help them slow down, and then if people are working too slow, I help them speed up. My job is to make sure everyone's on the same pace. Shouting's a big no-no. If people start shouting, then they're going to shout back at you. My job is to make sure I communicate with everyone at the same time. So my other job is to keep the producer happy, so to stay on schedule and make sure everything's going well with them. Overall, that's my job as a director. It can be a bit lonely and a bit difficult, but very exciting.
Hello, my name's Edith and I'm the second assistant. I'm also known as the clapper person. When we film, it's not always done in order. When we start a scene, I say which scene it is and what role it is, and then it helps us when we edit it. I keep everything organised in the middle of mayhem. I name every take so that we can put the puzzle back together. The birds you can hear now are real, but in a video, every time you hear a noise, it's always a special effect. I worked very close with the director and the sound people to make sure that everything was done properly.
My name is Annabelle and I'm one of the 2 DP in this documentary. I want to talk to you about how a digital team works together. The reason why we're getting better all the time is because we're talking together. It's a team that's full of comedians, but we also are serious at the same time. We worked really hard on the beach, but the picnic and the ice cream was really good too. Think of us like Tudor walkie-talkies. We're always talking together and keeping things in touch. Instead of saying things like open sesame, we say things like position, action and cut. Anyway, this is what I've learned. It's by talking to each other all the time that we create amazing things.
I want to share my story. Mr. Steph asked me to do it, so blame him. I'm a quiet person, but I learned something great. By making my life harder for myself, I become better at being me. That's why I volunteered with the Year 7 crew. I became the gaffer. It wasn't easy, and that's okay. That's why we work as a team. I am many other things too, but if you see me, just call me Jacqueline.
Hello, my name is Amy. I'm the DP for the documentary of the Tudors. The DP is a director of photography. People think I just press a button, but there's a lot more to it. First I set up the white balance, then I set the ISO. The darker it is, the higher the ISO. If the ISO is too high, the image will be bad. This is why I work with Jacqueline, because she does all the lighting so I can get a good image. Then I decide how many frames per second I will shoot. We're going to shoot at 25 frames per second. Then I decide what aspect I shoot, and we're shooting 16:9. That's the same as a rectangular TV. Then I choose the aperture. Large aperture means the foreground and the background are blurry. Small aperture, everything is sharp. Here I use the monitor and everything in red is sharp. If I mess anything up, the shot is worse than the phone, but if I get everything right, I create magic.